Welcome to Afterimage. I'm David Kurlander. I'm the editorial producer for the Cafe and Vox Media Podcast Network history show Now and Then. For those who missed our first installment, Afterimage is a new video series that aims to examine overlooked pieces of media from the lives of inspiring folks who have recently passed on. This week, we're talking to a remarkable director, Andrew Davis, about the career of a riveting character actor named Henry Silva. If you don't know Silva's name, you probably know his face. He's one of the most iconic tough guys of film, with a magisterial career that stretched from the 1950s to the early 2000s. He was a tertiary member of the Rat Pack, who played one of the thieves in the original 1960 Ocean's 11. He was a gangster opposite Sammy Davis Jr. in the 1963 Johnny Cool. In the 1970s, he starred in a gritty slate of influential Italian gangster movies, anchored by increasingly brutal turns in films by Fernando De Leo and Umberto Lenzi. And by the early 1980s, Silva was back in mainstream American action films. And that's where he teamed up with Andrew Davis. Davis directed Silva in two such movies, opposite Chuck Norris in the 1985 Code of Silence, and opposite Steven Seagal and Pam Grier in the 1988 Above the Law. And in each movie, Silva plays an extremely scary villain. The two films help to form Davis's unique aesthetic, often Chicago-based, always a deft combination of action and politics that reached larger audiences with Under Siege and The Fugitive, starring Harrison Ford, which was nominated for 7 Academy Awards, including Best Picture. So we're thrilled to talk today to Andrew Davis about the career of Henry Silva. Andrew Davis, thank you so much for joining us.
Good to see you.
So you directed Henry Silva in 2 films. The first was Code of Silence from 1985, where he was opposite Chuck Norris, and he played a drug kingpin named Luis Camacho. And then 3 years later, you directed him again in Above the Law in 1988 with Steven Seagal, where he played Kurt Zagon, who was kind of a CIA torture specialist. I want to start with Code of Silence and get a sense of how you first came into contact with Silva and what your familiarity with him was at the time that you started working on that film.
Wow. I don't remember exactly how Henry's name came into the picture, looking for a very scary heavy who could play a Colombian drug lord. There were Dick Cordos and Nan Charbonneau cast the movie, and I don't know if it came out of their ideas or my ideas. I was familiar with Henry because of his working with Kazan, one of his first movies, which was Viva Zapata. And I think he wasn't even credited. He was a kid when he did the movie. And a friend of my father's named Lou Gilbert was in that movie. So I was very aware of its politics and its revolutionary this and, the controversy with Kazan over the blacklist and talking to the committee. And so anyway, he had this incredible face that was so scary in terms of playing this heavyweight guy that we cast him. And I had done a film in Colombia years before called Paco. I was the cameraman, and I think wrote some of it and associate producer. So I had been working in South America, and I fell in love with Colombia, actually. And so we turned this group of Latin American drug dealers into the Camacho family. And the history of how that whole evolved is very sort of complicated. The original Code of Silence script did not have that storyline in it. I think it was something that was written originally for Clint Eastwood. And then when I got involved, I brought my friend Mike Gray to work with me on the script. And we invested ourselves in kind of a history of what was going on with the drug wars in Chicago. There was a family by the name of Herrera who actually ran the heroin out of Chicago through Mexico. And they would bring it up from South America and Mexico into Chicago. And a guy named Bulldog Drummond, who's in the movie, who's a journalist, told us about how every Thursday afternoon there was a $500,000 sitting on a table in Chicago in an apartment, and they would do this trade with the money and dope. And the Italian mob had talked about doing it, ripping these guys off. And they cased the joint, and it was too dangerous. A guy named Wally the Wiretapper knew about it. Anyway, so that's the basis of the opening of Code of Silence. Okay, and I just remember that when we put together a group of people, one of them is the guy who actually produced the movie in Colombia. His name was Daniel Abandano, and I think there's a character by the name of Abandano. Andre Marquis was his stage name. And so Henry was able to listen to the Colombian necktie story from the Colombians who were familiar with the tragedies of what was going on down there with people being tortured and stuff like that. So he just fit in so wonderfully with this group of actors that I was able to put together in Chicago mostly. And he was the sweetest guy to work with. I mean, he was so happy to be there. And he respected everybody, and we respected him, and his credits were amazing. If you look at I'm sure you'll go through this, but the number of great directors that he worked with is amazing.
I want to zoom in. You made a reference to the Colombian necktie, and there is this wild moment near the beginning of Code of Silence. I guess it's the first confrontation between Silva's character, Luis Camacho, and Chuck Norris, who's a police officer. I want to just talk about that moment. What sort of comes alive in that scene, and how Silva introduces this idea of a Colombian necktie to Norris.
Well, he just describes what they did, and the idea was he would cut the throat and pull the tongue through the throat, and that would be pretty disgusting. But it certainly made people stand up and listen, that he was capable of having this kind of terror to himself.
Yeah, it's a chilling scene, and it stays with me since I watched the movie. So I also wanted to talk briefly about the end moment of Code of Silence, because Camacho kind of spirals, and it's another just terrifying moment from Silva. And I just wanted to sort of zoom in on that scene and how you conceptualized it and what his role was in it.
Well, they've kidnapped the daughter of a cop partner of Chuck Norris's, and they're holding her hostage. And Chuck's got, of course, free her with this crazy device, this robot. And he has lost all his partners because of the Code of Silence. Nobody wants to help him. And so it's this wild warehouse on the south side of Chicago, by the mills where I grew up. And it was just this wonderful location with incredible light and scope, and Henry plays the madman, who when all of his people are lost, he goes crazy and he starts running after this girl with a hatchet, and Chuck Norris, of course, has got to stop him. But it was just Henry. It's interesting because Henry, when we did Above the Law, it was a few years later, and Henry's eyesight was not really great. By the time we did Above the Law, I don't remember what it was like in Code of Silence, but when we get to talking about Above the Law, there's this wonderful memory we have where he had a leaded glove on and he's beating up Steven Seagal, and he kept missing, and it didn't look real, and somehow Henry's eyesight or whatever, and he popped Seagal in the nose, and bleeding. Oh my God, it's a wrap. Everybody was so happy about that. But he came back the next day, and Seagal, nothing was wrong with him. He went to the emergency room. But everybody was cheering Henry for hitting Steven Seagal in the nose.
That's hilarious. What was his reaction to it? Do you remember? Did he feel bad?
And, of course he felt bad, but the crew didn't.
Well, let's go to Above the Law. I think that's a perfect segue to talk a little bit about that film, which is another just amazing film of that moment. And a very political film. And in that movie, Silva, is playing this particularly sinister CIA-affiliated character, Kurt Zagon. How did you think about that character, and why did you go back to Silva as another sort of villain for that role?
Well, it was based upon. Above the Law is interesting because it was originally hired to do a movie with Seagal based on Code of Silence. He had seen Code of Silence, and he told Michael Ovitz, his agent manager, that he wanted me to direct this movie. I didn't know who he was. I was supposed to direct maybe John Boyd or somebody else on that movie. It was a story about televisions being stolen off the docks of San Francisco and a bunch of crooked cops. And I met Seagal, and he said, I chose you. I said, I don't know if you can act. We did a screen test. We went to Chicago with Kelly LeBrock, his girlfriend at the time, and Joe Casala, one of the cops in Code of Silence, was in the screen test. And we did the test, and they said, it's great, looks terrific. And I was just taking little pieces of what this other script was about. I said, you're making the wrong movie with this guy. Whether he's lying or not, if his story about him coming out of Vietnam, having been a dojo master in Japan, and working for the CIA, I said, let's make that movie because it's more interesting than the story you've got about stealing televisions in the docks. And they said, well, how long will it take you to write it? And there was a Writers Guild strike coming up. And I was able to get Ron Shusett, who wrote Alien, and a guy named Steve Pressfield, who worked with me on it. And Seagal and I started working out a story, and we wrote the screenplay. And we wrote it in like 5 weeks. And that became the movie. And it became very political because I was very involved in Iran-Contra. I was very involved in the Golden Triangle and the CIA's involvement with using heroin to finance their illegal operations. And this is sort of the height of Iran-Contra when this was going on. And so Henry just seemed like the perfect guy to have been this kind of scary, duplicitous character who worked both in Southeast Asia and was now working with trying to shut up a senator who was investigating the illegal use of American CIA assets to prop up dictatorships and use money to finance their illegal wars.
I'm curious, did Henry have any sort of political perspective on that aspect of the film, or was he more just, I want to play this villain, I want to get it right? What were there conversations that you had with him about the political echoes of what you were doing?
Oh, yeah. I mean, he understood the role of the mafia in both all kinds of roles, both in helping the U.S. in World War II, in Italy, the invasion of Italy and Sicily. And he grew up in a neighborhood where their mobsters were all over the place, and so he understood the politics of it and supported our telling the truth about what was going on.
That's amazing.
Yeah, he was a very worldly guy. A kid came from New York with school when he was 13, and on his own got into the theater and worked with some amazing actors and filmmakers. So he was very worldly in that sense. He had seen everything and had been around the most glamorous parts of Italy and Europe as an actor, and was sort of revered here as a real interesting character.
Now, in that film, he sort of specializes in giving people extremely painful shots and this type of almost Marathon Man-esque torture. I'm curious if there were inspirations for that or how that particular element of his villainy entered into the scene here.
Yeah, I don't remember where that all came from, as part of the background of what we knew that they had been doing to people to make them talk about certain things. And was it Marathon Man, the film with Dustin Hoffman, where that was a technique that was used, and there was also the history of use of LSD with the CIA and making truth serums and things like that. So it was just one of those scary things that was brought to the table there. And and Henry got into it. He was almost having an orgasm talking about feeling it going through your body. You will tell me the truth now. It's almost like that, something out of a horror movie.
It really is. It's really scary. I mean, that's one of the things that I think made me want to talk with you, and that was so.
I'm really a gentle person, I'm not. This is the genre of the day, make the guy as tough as you can make him, scary as you can make him, show things that people don't want to talk about. Both these movies are playing around the world all the time. Still, I mean, it's just pretty crazy.
Yeah, that's an interesting part of all this. So, did you expect they'd have the kind of life that they've ended up having, and that people would still be watching them 35 years on?
Who knew what the world was going to be 35 years ago,
Yeah.
I'm just glad that because they both have, they're both, the stories and what they talk about is still very relevant. Secret programs that we don't know about that do damage to innocent people. It's interesting because now the FBI and the CIA have become sort of the good guys in terms of Trump.
Right.
In those days, the FBI and the CIA were not good guys. I mean, in terms of the civil rights movement, what was going on in Southeast Asia, overthrowing of governments, So that was a very interesting, it allowed me, with tough guy movies and action movies, you could say things politically that you couldn't do in a comedy.
Right.
The studio let you get away with it because, hey, the guy really kicked ass. He knows how to break his arm. There was all that stuff that was inherent in those kind of movies with martial artists as actors. But I'm proud of the fact that we were able to tell those stories then, and they still resonate today.
That's fascinating that almost the genre conventions allowed for more political commentary than in something that would have been expected to have been, more based on a political ideology. Right.
And yet, there's some complicated dynamics going on with the senator trying to kill a senator who wants to bring the truth out, and look what's happened. I mean, Pelosi's husband last week. I mean, it's nothing changes.
Yeah, there are way too many resonances. But I think that point that you make too about kind of intelligence agencies taking on a different kind of role, in this sort of institutional turn of the moment and as a response to Trump is fascinating because it is an interesting reminder to go back and watch these movies from the 80s where there is, a lot of suspicion towards these institutions and a lot of recognition of the harm they've caused. So it's a fascinating time capsule for sure. And I'm curious, sort of a final moment of focusing on Henry Silva. Is there a scene that you feel most exemplifies what made him special in either of these films, or that you remember the most as being one that was exciting to work with him on?
I just, it's funny, I have a sample reel of some of my clips from some of my work. And the shot I have of Henry is him standing at the window in the morgue looking at the bodies. And that close-up of him, where he just turns to the camera, I mean, it's like, whoa, it's an incredibly powerful image of this man's face. He was very scary looking. And yet it was so funny because, he was a real sweetheart of a guy. He was gentle and kind and giving. And I really want to get a hold of his kids, his son, because I didn't get to talk to him after I heard that Henry had passed, and would like to share some moments with him.
Well, that's amazing that he was a gentle person too. I mean, it sounds like you shared that, that you were making these tough movies, but that they were coming from a place of gentleness and of political passion and that an artistic passion, and that he too, was playing these very sinister people, but that, there was a kind and thoughtful man there as well.
Yeah. I feel very lucky to have worked with him, I know we lost touch later in the years, and I heard he was in the motion picture Home at some point. And I feel bad I didn't get a chance to sort of say goodbye to him. But we did have a long, deep friendship that went on after our work together.
That's amazing. And not to go too deep into that unless you want to, but I am curious, sort of those conversations after these films, were they still focused on movies? Did they go into other subject matter, sort of the nature of the friendship and what he liked to talk about?
Well, it's probably, what are you doing? Can I put you in my next movie? He was going to Italy a lot and working on films over there and keeping busy. I was concerned that he was staying busy and was happy with that kind of, attention he was getting. He didn't fall out of, and I think, Quentin Tarantino, of course, when I met him, and he knew all of my Corman movies as a cameraman. I worked with Pam Grier and I did a bunch of low budget horror or action movies, black action remakes for MGM and stuff. And I know that Quentin was very aware of Henry, and loved the fact that anything with Pam Grier, of course, with Henry he would be involved with. So the fact that Pam Grier and Henry Silva were working in the same scene, shooting at each other, was something that connected.
Right. No, I think you worked on Hitman, right? The movie with Pam Grier, that's sort of a remake of Get Carter.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's an amazing movie. Oh, I watched that recently and was really into it.
Cool Breeze, Hitman, The Slams, and Private Parts were 4 movies I did through Gene Corman and Danny Melnick had these MGM scripts, and they were sort of done under the table as low budget. And it's interesting because that was the beginning of my becoming a director, because I was working with all these first-time directors.
So all these resonances of stuff, from the early 70s, then kind of, Greer's and Above the Law. You've got Henry Silva there. It's almost like sort of a maturation of a process that had started a long time before.
The thing about Code of Silence and Above the Law, they were two of the first movies to be made in Chicago by studios after Daley died. And it started developing this understanding that there was a talent base of actors and crew members in Chicago. So then by the time I did The Package, and then of course The Fugitive, just opened everything up. And then they wound up doing a lot of big movies in Chicago from then on.
That's amazing. Yeah, I mean, it's Chicago is so, I know people say this about your work all the time, but it's such a character in both of these movies and feels really part of the action, not just as a setting, but as a state of mind and as a built environment. It's just amazing.
Yeah. Well, the location should always be a character.
Any other sort of moment from Henry Silva's life that you'd like to leave us with?
He had a scary twinkle in his eye. Mm-hmm. In terms of the role he played for me. He had the scariest twinkle in his eye, and that was what was appropriate for our leading man to have something to stand up against.
I love that.
Yeah.
Well, Andrew Davis, thank you so much for joining us and talking about the legacy of Henry Silva. And our listeners and viewers, check out both Code of Silence, 1985, and Above the Law, 1988, for two really legendary performances by one of the greatest heavies to ever do it, and one of our greatest character actors, Henry Silva.
Thank you for your time and all your research.
Thank you so much for checking out this second installment of After Image. And thank you to our guest, Andrew Davis, and to the brilliant Henry Silva for his life of often terrifying, always thrilling performances. We'll be back with more archival deep dives and conversations about incredible lives.